My name is Claire, and I'm 31 years old. I work as a paralegal at a small family law firm in Asheville, North Carolina, which means my days are spent untangling other people's messes, contested wills, property disputes, the ugly arithmetic of families falling apart. My colleagues joke that I've seen so much human ugliness at the office that I became immune to it. They were wrong. Nothing prepares you for the ugliness that wears your own family's face. My grandfather was the kind of man people write folk songs about. Retired carpenter, widower for the last decade of his life. A man whose hands were perpetually rough and whose laugh was perpetually warm. He had built the lakehouse himself in 1979, hauling timber and mixing concrete on a half-acre lot on the western edge of Lake Lure. I spent every summer there from the time I was 4 until I left for college. I learned to swim off that dock. I learned to read sitting in the screened porch with the sound of water everywhere. When my parents' marriage quietly disintegrated during my teenage years, the lakehouse was the only constant I had, and my grandfather was the only adult in my life who acted like one. He was my foundation, my North Star, and the most decent person I have ever known. He passed on a Thursday morning in late October. His neighbor called me because he had asked her to, years ago, saying he didn't want my mother or my aunt to be the ones to tell me. He had thought of everything. He always did. I was at my desk reviewing a deposition when my phone rang, and the world simply rearranged itself into a before and after with that single phone call. I drove the 2 hours to Lake Lure alone, crying so hard I had to pull over twice. When I finally stood on that dock and looked out at the water going gray in the autumn light, I could feel the shape of the loss like something physical, a hollow in my chest that the wind kept moving through. The call from his estate attorney came 2 days later. Her name was Margaret Holloway, and she had known my grandfather for over 20 years. She asked me to come to her office on Monday, and her voice had a careful quality to it that I recognized from my own professional life, the tone of someone who is delivering news that will change a room. I told her I'd be there. I didn't tell my sister until Sunday evening. My older sister and I had never been close in the way that people romanticize. She was 5 years older than me, and the gap had always felt wider than that. She was the kind of person who kept a spreadsheet of favors owed and never forgot a perceived slight. Her husband was cut from the same cloth, a commercial real estate broker who evaluated every room he walked into for its square footage and resale potential. When our grandfather was alive, she visited him twice a year at most, once at Christmas, once in summer, each visit lasting exactly as long as social obligation required. She sent him gift cards for his birthday. He always called me to ask what a gift card was for, exactly, and whether he needed a computer to use it. I always laughed. He always laughed. I would drive up and take him to the hardware store instead. When I called her that Sunday to tell her about the Monday meeting, she was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Do you know what's in the will? Not how are you holding up. Not I can't believe he's gone." Just that. I told her I didn't know the details yet. She said, "I think we should both be there." I told her Margaret had specifically asked for me. There was a pause, and I could hear the calculation running behind it. "He was my grandfather too," she said, and her voice had gone careful and flat in a way I knew meant she was controlling something larger. "I'll be there." Margaret's office was on the second floor of a brick building downtown, overlooking the main street with its coffee shops and boutiques. The leaves were full orange and red outside the window when I arrived. My sister was already there, seated in one of the leather chairs across from Margaret's desk, wearing a blazer and the particular expression she reserved for professional negotiations. Her husband had come too, uninvited, and sat beside her with his hands folded like he was attending a closing. Margaret looked at me when I walked in and gave me a small nod that communicated more than words could. She offered coffee. My sister declined on behalf of everyone. Margaret opened the folder in front of her. My grandfather had been thorough, as he was in everything. His estate included the lakehouse, appraised at just over $1.1 million, a savings portfolio worth approximately $280,000, and the contents of the property. He had left his truck and his tools to a younger man from his church who had apprenticed under him for years. He had left a fixed sum to his neighbor, the one who had called me, and he had left the lakehouse, the portfolio, and everything remaining to me. His only surviving granddaughter, as he had written in the document, who showed up. Those last 2 words sat in the room like a dropped stone. My sister's face went through several expressions very quickly. Shock, then a flash of something raw and ugly, then the smooth professional mask snapping back into place. Her husband straightened in his chair. Margaret kept her eyes on the document and kept reading. When she finished, my sister said, very quietly, "That can't be right." Margaret looked up. "I assure you the document is in order. Your grandfather was of clear and sound mind. He signed this will 14 months ago, with 2 witnesses and a notary present. He was old," my sister said. "He was isolated. I think he was being influenced." The word influenced landed in the room with a very specific weight. I knew exactly what she was implying, and so did Margaret. So did I. "By whom?" I asked. She looked at me. "By you, Claire. You were always up there. Always the favorite. You had access to him that the rest of us didn't. He trusted you, and you used that." I didn't say anything. I had learned, in my years of family law, that silence is often the most useful tool in a room. Margaret closed the folder. "If you have concerns about the validity of the will, you are of course entitled to explore your legal options. However, I should tell you that your grandfather anticipated exactly this possibility. He left a separate letter with me, to be shared with Claire at an appropriate time. He also took certain steps of his own to ensure his wishes were protected." She paused. "I would strongly recommend you consult an independent attorney before taking—" My sister stood up. Her husband stood up beside her. The two of them a unified wall of barely contained anger. "We will," she said, and her voice had gone cold and final. She looked at me one last time before she left. "This isn't over." The door closed behind them. Margaret and I sat in the quiet for a moment. "She's going to contest it," I said. "Almost certainly," Margaret agreed. "But she won't succeed." She reached into her desk drawer and produced an envelope with my name, written on it in my grandfather's handwriting. His penmanship had always been extraordinarily neat for a man who worked with his hands. I held it for a long moment before I opened it. He had written 3 pages. He told me about the summers, the way I had learned to love the lake before I could properly swim in it, the conversations we had had on the dock about life and work and what it meant to do things right. He told me he knew his older granddaughter would not understand his decision, but that understanding had never been the point. He wrote, "You were the one who showed up, Claire, not just for the holidays, not just when it was convenient. You showed up on the hard days, the boring days, the ordinary Tuesdays when I had nothing special to offer. That is what love looks like, and that is what this house is worth. I want you to have it. I want you to protect it." And then, in his precise carpenter's hand, he had written, "I have also taken certain steps to make sure you can." That was when Margaret began to explain what my grandfather had done. 11 months before he passed, he had come to her office, sharp and deliberate and entirely himself, and asked her to walk him through his options for protecting the lakehouse from a legal challenge. He had been watching the news. He had talked to his neighbor, whose own family had gone through a contested estate. He was a man who built things to last and who believed in proper foundations. Together, he and Margaret had transferred the lakehouse into an irrevocable trust, the C.J. Sullivan Family Trust, named for himself with me, named as the sole successor trustee and sole beneficiary. He had done this quietly, with a full mental competency evaluation from his primary care physician, documented on the same day. Evidence that he understood exactly what he was signing and why. The lakehouse no longer belonged to my grandfather as a person. It belonged to a legal entity. When he passed, it passed seamlessly to me as trustee, bypassing probate entirely. There was nothing to contest. There was nothing to challenge. Any attempt to argue undue influence over my grandfather's personal property was arguing over property he no longer personally owned. I sat with that for a long moment. The grief and the love and the careful, deliberate protection, all folded together into something I couldn't name. He had built me a fortress, just as surely as he had built the house itself. He had laid the foundation in secret, with his own hands, and waited. Margaret looked at me across the desk. "He was a very thorough man," she said. "Yes," I said. "He was." The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of mourning and siege. I moved my things to the lakehouse officially, taking my accumulated leave from the firm. My grandfather's presence was everywhere, his worn flannel jacket on the hook by the door, his reading glasses on the side table, his coffee mug still in the drying rack. I moved through the rooms gently, the way you move through a place that is still full of someone. I was not ready to change anything. I was not going to change anything. My sister called 3 times in the first week. Each time, her voice had the quality of a negotiation just barely disguised as family concern. She said things like, "I just think we should talk about what makes sense here, and grandfather would have wanted us to do this together." She never once asked how I was doing. She never once mentioned missing him. I kept the calls short and gave her nothing. Her husband texted me on a Friday evening. "Claire, we should set up a time to discuss the property. We've spoken to an attorney and we believe there are grounds for a challenge. Would be better to handle this as a family." I did not respond to that text. On a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the reading of the will, they showed up at the lakehouse unannounced. I saw their car from the kitchen window and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with the November air. They walked up the dock path like they owned it, my sister ahead, her husband just behind her with the look of a man who has come to a business meeting, rather than a house where his wife's grandfather had just died. My sister was wearing her professional face again. There was something underneath it, a kind of restrained triumph that made my stomach tighten. "We need to talk," she said when I opened the door. I let them in because refusing would have given her something to spin. I made no offer of coffee or tea. We stood in the kitchen because I did not invite them to sit down. She got to it quickly. That was something I had always reluctantly respected about her. She didn't dance. "We've had an attorney review the situation," she said. "Grandfather's will is challengeable on grounds of undue influence and potential diminished capacity. You were his primary caregiver for the last 2 years. You had exclusive access. The will was rewritten when he was 78 and in declining health." "He was not in declining health," I said. "He was in excellent health for his age, and I was not his caregiver. I was his granddaughter who visited." "That's your characterization," her husband said. I looked at him. "Why are you here?" He didn't answer. My sister pressed forward. "Here's what we're proposing, and I think it's more than fair. We sell the lake house. The market is very strong right now for lakefront property in this area. After fees and taxes, we split the proceeds down the middle. You keep the investment accounts. We walk away clean. You get more than half the total estate. No court fight, no ugliness, just a reasonable solution." Reasonable. I had heard that word used to dress up unreasonable demands for years in the law office. It always meant reasonable to me. I give you nothing and you hand over what I want. "No," I said. Her face tightened. "Claire," I said, "no. This house is mine. Grandfather wanted me to have it and to live in it. I'm not selling it." She looked at me for a long moment. Then that restrained quality in her expression shifted, and the triumph underneath it surfaced fully. "Then we'll let the court decide," she said. "Our attorney has already filed a petition to contest the will. The process will take months, possibly years. The estate will be frozen while it's litigated. You won't be able to do anything with the property. You'll be dealing with legal fees and depositions and hearings while you're trying to grieve, and in the end, the court may award us exactly what we're asking for now, or more." She tilted her head. "Is that really what you want? Is that what he would have wanted?" That was the part that was meant to land. The appeal to his wishes. Using him as a lever. I felt something happen in me then. Something I recognized from my years of watching contested family cases resolve. It was the moment when the emotional noise quieted and the procedural clarity took over. The part of me that was grieving stepped back, and the part of me that understood the mechanics of what she had just described stepped forward. I also knew something she did not know. "You're right that it would be a long process," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "It would be expensive, and you would lose." I looked at her, and I felt a very particular calm. "But that's your choice to make." She blinked. She had expected more tears, panic, a counteroffer. The steadiness unsettled her. "We'll be in touch through our attorney," her husband said, filling the silence. They left. I watched their car back down the gravel drive and disappear around the tree line. The lake was flat and gray in the morning light, and somewhere a woodpecker was working at a distant tree. I stood on the porch for a while before I went inside and called Margaret. Margaret listened to everything I described, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Let them file. Let them spend the money on discovery." There was something in her voice that sounded like a teacher who has already seen the end of an exam. The will challenge has no merit, and more importantly, it doesn't matter. They can challenge the will successfully and still end up with nothing. Because of the trust, I said. Because of the trust. The will governs personal property. The lake house is not in your grandfather's personal estate to contest. It transferred to the trust over a year ago. It is entirely outside the scope of the will challenge. The most they can argue over is the investment portfolio, and with the competency documentation we have, they will not win that either. She paused. But I want them to fully commit to this before we show them what they're walking into. What do you mean? Have they asked to see the property again? To have it assessed? Not yet. They will. They'll want a formal appraisal for the litigation. When they do, agree to it. Let them bring whoever they want. Let them feel certain they're moving forward. Her voice was even and deliberate. I want to be the one to explain the trust to them in person, with documentation, in front of anyone they bring with them. I understood what she was describing. I had seen it done in court, the carefully timed reveal that leaves no room for spinning, no room for a graceful exit, because the exposure happens in public with witnesses present. The harder they fall, the cleaner the ending. Okay, I said. Don't warn them. Don't hint. Don't change your behavior. Let them believe they are winning. I spent the next 3 weeks doing exactly that. My sister's attorney sent 2 formal letters, both of which Margaret received and responded to with patient procedural language that gave nothing away. My sister called once more, her tone almost collegial now, as if we were merely negotiating a business deal. She mentioned that their appraiser needed to do a walkthrough of the property. I said, of course. She mentioned they might be bringing a second party. I said that was fine. She sounded satisfied with my cooperation in a way that made something cold and quiet turn over in my chest. I did not tell her that I had already spoken to Margaret. I did not tell her what I knew. I said, of course, and I'll have the door open, and that all sounds fine. The night before, I sat on the dock in the dark with a blanket and a cup of coffee, and talked to my grandfather the way I sometimes talked to him when he was alive, not expecting an answer, just sending the thoughts out toward the water. I told him what was happening. I told him I was scared, not of losing, but of what it meant that we had come to this, that his granddaughter, who had grown up in the same house, who had been given the same chances at knowing him, had looked at his passing and seen only a transaction. I told him I was angry in a way that felt too big to hold. I told him I would protect the house. I told him I was sorry he had known all along that this would happen. The lake didn't answer, but it moved, the way water always moves, quietly and without stopping. The morning was cold and sharp. Margaret arrived at 9:30 in her navy coat, carrying her portfolio with the same unshakable composure I had noticed the first time I met her. She walked through the house briefly, noting the stacked boxes of my grandfather's belongings. I'd been slowly sorting, not staging, just the genuine slow labor of going through a life, and she nodded once, as though the scene confirmed something. Are you ready? She asked. More or less, I said. That's enough, she said. My sister arrived at 10 with her husband, their attorney, a thin man in his 50s, who kept checking his phone, and a property appraiser carrying a clipboard. There were also, to my surprise, a couple I didn't recognize who arrived in a separate car and stood near the dock, looking out at the lake with the careful, assessing interest of people who are considering a purchase. My sister had brought buyers. She had brought buyers before the litigation was even resolved, before she owned a single inch of the property, before a single court had agreed with a single argument her attorney had made. She had brought buyers to my grandfather's house, and she was already showing it to them, already selling the vision of a transaction she had not yet earned the right to make. The audacity of it was so complete it almost looped around into something I could admire for a split second. She came up the porch steps ahead of the group, and when she saw me standing in the doorway, something moved across her face, a small, involuntary softening that might have been guilt, or might have been something older and more complicated than that. Then it was gone. Claire, she said, thanks for being cooperative about this. Of course, I said. She looked past me into the house and registered the boxes, the quiet, the general sense of resignation I had worked to project. Something in her relaxed. She turned to the couple behind her and said, "The bones of this place are incredible. Original construction, entirely custom. And the waterfront footage, there's nothing comparable on this side of the lake." Margaret stepped forward from the hallway. My sister stopped. Her husband stopped. Their attorney looked up from his phone. Margaret introduced herself to the room with the measured, unhurried confidence of someone who has no need to hurry. She addressed the couple by the dock first, her voice carrying through the open door. "Before you go any further, I need to make you aware of something that materially affects this situation. This property is not available for sale. It is not owned by the individuals who invited you here. You have been brought to this location under a significant misrepresentation of the facts." She paused. "I'd strongly recommend you leave and consult your own counsel before engaging further with any of the parties here today." The couple looked at my sister. My sister looked at Margaret. Her husband's jaw had tightened in a way that made the muscles at his temples stand out. "Who are you?" the opposing attorney asked. "I am Margaret Holloway, estate attorney for the C.J. Sullivan Family Trust. I represent Claire Sullivan, the sole trustee and beneficiary of the trust, which is the legal owner of this property." She opened her portfolio and produced 2 documents, holding them so the room could see. "This is the deed of transfer, executed 11 months ago, conveying the lake house from Charles James Sullivan personally to the C.J. Sullivan Family Trust. It is recorded with Henderson County. This second document is a certified copy of the trust instrument, naming my client as sole trustee." She looked at the opposing attorney directly. "Your client's will challenge is procedurally irrelevant to the ownership of this property. The house was not in Mr. Sullivan's personal estate at the time of his death. It cannot be contested through probate proceedings. The document you have been building a case around does not govern this asset." The couple by the dock did not wait to hear more. The husband said something quietly to his wife, and they moved toward their car with the particular quick walk of people removing themselves from a situation they did not sign up for. My sister was staring at the documents in Margaret's hands. That's not possible. He transferred the deed? When? Why didn't we?" She stopped herself. "Why didn't you know?" Margaret finished for her, her voice entirely without cruelty. "Because he didn't tell you. He wasn't required to." "This is a trick," her husband said. "This is something she set up after the fact, too." "The transfer was recorded nearly a year ago," Margaret said. "The date is on the document. Your own attorney can verify it in the public record this afternoon." She looked at him steadily. "I would also point out that you have just attempted to show and potentially sell a property you do not own to prospective buyers, which constitutes a misrepresentation with legal consequences of its own. I suggest you think carefully about your next steps." The opposing attorney had put his phone in his pocket. He was looking at the documents with the careful, unhappy attention of a man recalibrating. My sister turned to me. The professional mask was gone. What was underneath it was something I hadn't seen on her face since we were children. A rawness, an unguardedness, and I couldn't tell if it was shame or just the shock of being genuinely defeated for the first time in a long time. "Claire," she said. Her voice was different, smaller. "Did you know? The whole time? You knew he had done this?" I looked at her. I thought about the summers, the dock, the woodpecker outside the window this morning. I thought about the Christmas visits and the gift cards and my grandfather quietly building things that lasted. "He told me to protect it," I said. "So I did." Margaret placed a third document on the kitchen table and set her pen beside it. She explained, quietly and completely, what it contained. My sister and her husband would formally acknowledge that the will contest was withdrawn and that they had no claim, present or future, to the lake house, the trust, or any asset held within it. They would acknowledge that the attempt to misrepresent the property's ownership to prospective buyers had occurred. In exchange, Margaret would not file a formal complaint with the state bar regarding their attorney's participation in the showing, and I would not pursue civil damages for the misrepresentation. The restraining order she had prepared would keep both of them off the property permanently. "You have until I leave today to sign," Margaret said. "After that, we proceed differently." Their attorney leaned in and spoke quietly to them for 2 minutes. My sister kept her eyes on the table. Her husband's jaw worked. At the end of 2 minutes, the attorney straightened up and gave a very small, very defeated nod. Her husband signed first. His hand was controlled, but too fast, the signature of a man who wants to be done with something. My sister picked up the pen and held it for a moment. She looked at me one final time, and I recognized, underneath everything, the shape of my own grief reflected back not for the house, not for the money, but for the version of a family we had both, apparently, been quietly mourning for different reasons, and for much longer than either of us had admitted. She signed. Margaret gathered the documents, shook hands with no one, and walked out. I heard her car on the gravel, and then the only sound was the lake. My sister and her husband left without speaking. The door closed behind them with the same soft click it had made 10,000 times before, and then the house was simply mine, and quiet, and entirely itself. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I looked at the boxes I had been slowly filling with my grandfather's things, the careful archaeology of a life I was not ready to archive. I picked up the nearest box and carried it to the storage room off the back porch, and then I came back and moved his reading glasses from the side table to the bookshelf beside his chair, where I could see them from the couch. I put his flannel jacket back on the hook by the door. The afternoon light came through the lake-facing windows the way it always had, long and amber and particular to that latitude and that hour. And I understood, not for the first time but more completely than before, why he had built here, why he had hauled the timber up by hand, why he had stayed. Some places are worth fighting for. Some gifts come with the tools to protect them already built in, laid into the foundation by someone who understood what you would face before you did. I had not been given a house. I had been given a lesson and the means to apply it, from a man who had spent his whole life building things that held. That evening, I took his worn blanket out to the dock and sat until it was fully dark and the stars were clear over the water. The grief was still there, and it would be there for a long time. But underneath it, solid as cedar and stone, was something that felt like peace. Not the peace of having won. Exactly. More the peace of having kept a promise to someone who deserved to have his promises kept. The lake was still. The dock held. The house behind me was exactly where it had always been. I was home,